I learned about Constant Lecorgne from my aunt, a woman named Maud Lecorgne, when I was a child. But I didn't pay attention to his story until many years later. Since about 5 years ago, when violent white supremacy has become part of the bread and butter of American politics, I thought it would be important to tell the story of a family member who was a violent white supremacist. My name is Edward Ball, and I wrote the book Life of a Klansman, A Family History in White Supremacy.
Constant Lecorgne was Edward Ball's great-great-grandfather.
He was a Creole French carpenter who lived during the middle of the 1800s. He fought in the Civil War, and afterwards he came home to New Orleans and joined some of the Ku Klux Klan militias that were operating in the South. He joined a militia called the Knights of the White Camellia, which was one of the first white supremacist militias. And they were costumed, they were disguised, they ran in the backwoods of Louisiana parishes, sometimes in hoods and sometimes in robes. And they did what they called night riding. And they charged through black villages, marauding anybody they found. Because black folks were entering politics, they were starting businesses, they were talking back to white people. And this was shocking and unacceptable to the majority of the white population.
Lecorgne and thousands like him perpetrated acts of mass terror that echo to this day.
The first episode of white terror in which Constant became involved was called the Mechanics Institute Massacre. In the summer of 1866, there was a mass meeting of hundreds of African Americans who were petitioning for the right to vote for black men. And the mayor of New Orleans, who was white, sent the police and the firemen. The fire brigades, interestingly, were a kind of center of white-led violence against black people. And Constant was a fireman in a fire brigade called the Home Hook and Ladder Company. He sent the fire brigades to break up this meeting. After 2 hours of shooting and beating with clubs, about 200 African Americans lay dead, their bodies scattered around the paving stones. A second big episode in which he was involved was an attempted coup on the state government in Louisiana. In 1873, he was part of a force that lay siege to several police stations. A year later, he was part of a militia called the White League, which was a big force of several thousand men that succeeded in overthrowing the Reconstruction government in a battle called the Battle of Canal Street. A little bit after this Battle of Canal Street, Congress decided to withdraw the U.S. Army troops that were still in the South and bring them back to the North, and that led to the replacement of all the governments, which were interracial governments, with all white governments in the South, and it led to the beginning of Jim Crow segregation, as we call it now.
Ball describes how the Klan got its start.
The phrase Ku Klux Klan was coined by the founders of the group in 1866, a group of 6 men in Tennessee who probably belonged to fraternities and Greek societies when they were in their college years, and they said to themselves, we need to call ourselves something mysterious. let's call ourselves Q close, which is the Greek word for circle. And somebody else in the group said, let's add the word Klan to that, and that'll be really enigmatic. So they came up with this idea of misspelling using K's and as many words as they could, and they devised this phrase that still scares people to this day, 150 years later, Ku Klux Klan.
Ball says the Klan reemerges periodically during critical junctures in U.S. history.
There were 3 Ku Klux Klans. My ancestor, Constant Lecorgne, participated in the first generation Reconstruction years. Those 12 years were marked by violence by about 50,000 Southern white men who belonged to these hooded and robed militias. They went out of business because they succeeded in achieving their goal, which was to reestablish white supremacy. 50 years later, the second Ku Klux Klan erupts in the mid-19-teens after a very popular movie called Birth of a Nation, which celebrated the Ku Klux victories of the Reconstruction era. They were somewhat less violent, but they supported anything and everything that would exclude people of color from achieving their rights as citizens, and they opposed immigration of certain classes and nations to this country. During the Civil Rights Movement 50 years ago, the third Klan erupts.
The community was greatly disturbed to find this extremist organization in its midst.
And these were scattered militias of 10 to 100 men in the states of the Deep South who harassed civil rights workers and sometimes set off bombs in front of people's houses and burned crosses. And they were trying to torment the civil rights movement out of existence. In the present, the Ku Klux Klan is an almost non-existent organization, but it has been well replaced by dozens upon dozens of armed militias scattered through the Northwest and the Southwest, who are super nationalistic, who are sometimes separatists and survivalists.
Though the Klan may seem to be on the fringes of American society, Ball says it is not as far away as many people think.
The fact is, to have a Klansman in your family tree is not a rare thing. My estimate is that about 1/2 of all white Americans can claim an ancestor who participated in the Ku Klux Klan at one point or another. That is to say, about 140 million white people in this country have had a Klansman in the family.
And that is part of the story of America.
Our country was founded on acts of violent white supremacy, from the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Native Americans and the importation of hundreds of thousands of Africans, and eventually the enslavement of somewhere near 4 million African Americans on the plantations of the South.
Though it may be painful, it's all the more reason to study the past.
It gives me grief to know that I have a family member who was directly involved in acts of white terror, and yet I think that we all look away from these stories intentionally, and I think wrongly. I think that a better way forward is to try to reckon with these kinds of histories that we hold in common, because only by reckoning with them can we find a path to healing.